this new way of living. Now, there's another tradition which we call the cultic. All right, when you think about cults, all right, what are cults like? Brainwashing, right? Usually, there's a center person or something central that everybody has to focus on. And do you ask questions? No, you do it that way. Scholars talk about what they call the cultic worship. It was focused on the temple, and we're going to get to that in a second. But it was this is the way you're supposed to do things, right? And it would emphasize the don't, right? Think about the video from Monty Python, right? What happens if you say Jehovah? You get stoned, right? Right? You're killed, And what kind of God does that? A God of love or a God of wrath? So it's really two different understandings of God. Is God about wrath or is God about love? The prophetic says, God is about love who sets people free, who enters into our world and invites us in a new way of community, right? But this cultic or this purity focus says, you need to be this way if you're going to make it in, right? What I want to talk about is just a little bit about where this comes from. Now, the Ten Commandments come about after God has brought them out of Egypt. God has set them free. And after they come out of Egypt, then they go to the Promised Land. It takes a little while because they messing up and stuff. And it's a whole other story. But when they get to the Promised Land, they divide the land up among them. And do you know how they divide it up? They divide it up by families. And every family gets the same size plot of land based on the size of itself. One needs more, it's a little bigger, but so that every person has a fair share. Right? Now, the land is not something you can sell. It's your family's forever and ever. You cannot lose this. In fact, they even said this thing called the year of Jubilee, where the land would be returned to you if you ever had to sell it because you got so poor, you had to sell yourself in slavery, you would go free. Every 50 years, everything was set back the way it was so that everyone would be equal. And for years, this is the way things were. Everyone had a piece of land. In fact, if you read the book of Judges, they don't even have kings. They don't have any kind of government. It's almost like anarchy, right? There's no government. And they function as these tribes, and they come together when they need to, if there are powers that come in. Otherwise, they live their lives in relationship with God. And then when you come to the book of 1 Samuel, people start looking at the nations around them and say, they've all got kings. We want a king. Don't you want a king? Kings are wonderful things. And the prophet Samuel says, are you really sure you want that? Because you know what's going to happen if you get a king? They're going to, you're going to have to pay taxes. Try not to. No. You're going to be forced to labor, and things are not going to be good. And the people all say, we don't care because we want a king. But isn't God your king? No, we want our own king. He says, okay, then God's going to give you what you want. Within 400 years, archaeologists looking at the land say, you know what, at the time of Judges, there was very little poverty. Everybody had what they needed. The economy wasn't as good as it was 400 years later, but the good economy 400 years later, say, were just a small number of people who were very wealthy, who had taken most of the land, and most of the people lived in poverty. And there was hunger, disease, and it was a very difficult time because it sustained just a small group at the top. Right? So from the time the kings onward, they said, we want to have a king. Things change. The other thing that happens in this is before this time, people worshiped God wherever they were. Right? When they had a king, then they said, you know what, if we have a king and he's in Jerusalem, guess what we have to have in the center of Jerusalem also? We have to have a temple. And this is the only place you can go to really worship God. And this is the only place you can bring your sacrifices, and that's the only way you get forgiven is if you do this. So everything centers out of that. All right? And the prophets begin to rise up at this time, saying, you know what, this isn't a good thing. You know what? We're centering everything here. People have to do things the way they were told, and you're creating injustice. Right? In fact, I think that makes it look good. Actually, skip to the Amos one. This is from Matthew, where Jesus really affirms this tradition of the prophets. Did you find it? You see what's his Amos? Okay. Oh, there we go. Amos, one of the prophets, is talking about this. He says, you know what? I can't stand your religious meetings. I'm fed up with your conferences and conventions. This is the Message version. All right. He says, I want nothing to do with your religious projects, your pretentious slogans and goals. I'm sick of your fundraising schemes, your public relations and image making. I've had all I can take of your noisy ego music. When was the last time you sang to me? You know what I want? I want justice, oceans of it. I want fairness, rivers of it. That's what I want. That's all I want. Now listen to this in today's New International Version. Next one, if you could. It says, I despise your religious festivals. I can't stand your assemblies. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. But let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. Now, what's interesting about this is the author of the message is saying, let's take this and put it into our time. We want to talk about that a little bit. But in the community, it's kind of helpful to talk about the time of the prophets and the saying, look, these people were doing their offerings, all these things that they thought they were supposed to do in this cultic religion, this purity-focused thing. And God is saying, you know what, I don't want that. I want justice. Right? Now, the thing about this, and I want to just kind of get back to this, is that you can take many of these texts in the Bible and you can interpret them both ways. All right? We just look at the Ten Commandments saying, really, this is prophetic. It's about God inviting us to a new way of community, a God who sets us free. Right? But others look at it and say, no, this is about purity. Don't do this. Don't do this, or this is bad. All right? God is going to get you if you mess up, so you need to keep this focus. And coming out of the Ten Commandments, you know how many commandments actually there are in the what they call the Torah that people were supposed to follow? Anyone want to guess?
660 something.
663. That's right. 663 commandments you're supposed to follow. All right? Including what kind of food you can eat and can't eat. So no pork. Anybody here like barbecue ribs or bacon? Yeah, sorry about that. All right? And all kinds of interesting things about, like, while there are very clearly ethical things about don't murder and how you deal with it, or things like, you know what, don't sleep with your wife during that time of the month, or you're going to get stoned. It's just one of those things. Oh, you know that, all right? So Jesus, in the prophetic tradition, basically looked at this and said, you know what we're concerned about, what God really is concerned about is those ethical things about how we treat each other. But the purity side says, you know what? If this is about God as wrathful, we've got to be very careful and follow all these exactly, all right? And so we've got to keep those. By the time of Jesus, you see this in the Pharisees, right? This is the way we have to do things. The prophets were speaking out against this, and basically they came about the time of the kings until the kingdoms were destroyed, and they were dispersed. But they come back to the land, and the first thing they do is, you know what? They say, you know why it was that God sent us into exile? Because we weren't pure enough. So all you men, if you've married wives who aren't Jewish, you need to put them away, even if you have kids, even if it means they have to go and beg or they have to go into prostitution, and you need to make yourself pure. We're going to rebuild the temple and center everything here again. All right? So by the time of Jesus, you see the same things happening. Again, the land is owned by a small few. And so when Jesus comes up and says, you know what? We're going with this tradition of Isaiah, the prophetic. You see that he is speaking out against this way of purity. Now, I mentioned two words, exegesis and hermeneutic. And these are one big words you get in seminary. And I was trying to remember, how the heck do you remember what they mean? Exegesis, I was thinking, think about it has the word Jesus in it, right? It's saying, this understanding what things were happening at the time of the text, right? So Jesus isn't in all the text of the Bible, in flesh, but saying what happened then. And hermeneutic is like Herman's a today name. Jesus is from back then. It's how do you talk about it today? And so Jesus had to do the same thing. Jesus was looking at what happened before him and what was happening now and said, how does this apply now? And he began to look at it saying, this looks a lot like what we saw at the time of the prophets. That the same thing is happening, that people are told you have to live this way and keep yourself pure. We do that a little bit now, like no dancing, no smoking, no swearing, those kind of things. And we need to go this other way. Go ahead and click the next one here. All right? And this is a story from John, and this is very interesting. I want to you can kind of click through it, I'm just going to tell it. Jesus goes into the land of Samaria, and Samaria was created when the kingdom of Israel was split because of this whole issue of purity. You only had to go to Jerusalem. The people in the north didn't like it, and the king wanted to make them. And so they split. So, the way that you keep people together is you have that central religion. So they built their own temple on Mount Samaria, so everybody in their land would worship there. When the Jews came and they destroyed it. And after the exile, when they came back to the land of Samaria, they married the people who were there. They stayed together with them, and the Jews despised them for it. They hated them. It was a race issue. So they never wanted to connect with them. In fact, if you read the story of the Good Samaritan, it's so much about this issue. So Jesus goes through the land of Samaria. And it's really interesting because most Jews would avoid it, even though it was the shortest route. They would go around. But when we read Jesus, it says he had to go there. That's a place that God has called him to be. So he goes to this woman, who's a Samaritan woman, and asks her to give him a cup of water. And of course, men are also not supposed to talk to women in public, much less have women go to stoning, right? But he does. And they begin to have this interesting conversation about God and God's presence. And And he asked her for a drink, and she's like, well, why would you do that? Because Jews in those days wouldn't share that, or wouldn't, go ahead and click it, right? Wouldn't be caught dead talking to Samaritans, as they put it. So Jesus begins talking with her about these things, and they come to talk about Samaritans and Jews because Jesus starts entering into things in her life that she doesn't want to deal with because he understands her journey. And so she says to him, well, you know what, you all worship in your mountain, we worship by ours, you know, we don't really know what's right, so we should probably stop talking about this. And Jesus says this interesting thing, keep going on, a few more. I gave one, probably should have up here, sorry about that. Yeah, keep going. I'll tell you when. One more. You're a prophet. So this, our ancestors worshiped God here, but you said Jerusalem is the place you have to worship. Right? Next one. Jesus says, you know what? There's a time coming when you Samaritans will worship God, Father, either here at this mountain or there in Jerusalem. Right? Says it's not going to matter where you're at. Says you worship God in the dark, we worship in the light of day, but God's way of salvation has come to the Jews. Keep going. It's coming, in fact, time is coming when it won't matter what you're called or where you go to worship. He says it's who you are and the way you live that count before God. Your worship must engage your spirit in the pursuit of truth. That's the kind of people that the Father is looking for, those who are simply and honestly themselves before Him in worship. So the center of this cultic practice was in Jerusalem. What's Jesus saying about this temple in Jerusalem? It's not going to matter anymore. Now, I don't think we realize how deeply this is. Now, it's not just about worship, all right? Because in the next text, go ahead, click to the next one after the end of this. No, I mean, there's a separate one from, I think it's Mark. In the book of Mark, one of the central places where they decide they're going to kill Jesus, comes from this. Jesus, when he comes to Jerusalem near the end of the Gospel of Mark, he enters the temple, and he starts throwing everyone out who had set up shop there, buying and selling. And he kicked over the tables of the bankers and the stalls of the pigeon merchants. He didn't let anyone even carry a basket to the temple. And he taught them, quoting this text, my house was designated a house of prayer for the nations. You've turned it into a hangout of thieves. And the high priests and religious scholars heard what was going on and plotted how they might get rid of him. They panicked, for the entire crowd was carried away by his teaching. All right. So Jesus comes to the temple and he begins to kick out the money changers. All right. I'll give just a little background. If the only place you can worship is the temple, and it's the only place you can give your offering. And the offering couldn't use the coin of Caesar at the time because Caesar's coin had Caesar's image and it said Caesar, son of God. And so it was blasphemy. Right? So you had to go and trade it in. So in the courtyard out there, you had money changers that you could exchange it for. You also had to offer animals that were unblemished. They couldn't have a limp or any kind of spot. And so if you were coming from way out of town, you weren't going to make it there if your animal had to walk the whole way, right? And so you would buy your animal there. Only guess what? Prices were a lot higher. You ever notice it's like the interstate with the gas stations, right? You know? Only it was exorbitantly high. And people who were poor especially couldn't afford this or would take their very livelihood, but they were told they had to do this. So Jesus comes in and he casts out these money changers and these people who are taking advantage of this and says, look, this isn't about making money off these people. This is God's house. Only who gets upset with him? It's the religious leaders. Right? Because they're the ones who've been gaining from this. You know, I remember one of my seminary professors talking about this. He said, you know, as soon as a movement becomes an institution, the goal no longer is what the religious movement was about. It's about maintaining the institution. And really, Jesus is speaking out against this. The temple had become the center of worship, but it's also the place that people were used, where people were cheated. It was the center of a system that kept some people down and just a few people up. And this is what Jesus is speaking out against, saying this is the way it should be.